Hello, my name is Rand, and today we're going to talk about 5 tips on how to use analogs in your world building. This is based on my book, 185 Tips on World Building, which you can get for free or 99 cents just by looking in the episode description and clicking the appropriate link. There's also a bunch of other cool stuff there, so check it out. The first tip is to use analogs. If you're not sure what that is, it's pretty simple. Basically, when you're inventing a fictional place or people or whatever, you can base that on something from Earth. So let's say you create a country that is modeled on Japan. This saves us a lot of time, and it also prevents us from having to just invent things from scratch. It's a good idea to use analogs to speed up your world building because it's much harder to create something like a culture from scratch than to borrow one from Earth. This is also true of things like plants, animals, and species like elves and dwarves. Taking a plant as an example, if we try to create one from scratch, we might be trying to figure out what its climate is, its growing season, its harvesting season, and all this other stuff. This can be difficult, and it's something like getting into horticulture. Why do that when we can decide that our plant is just like a rose, for example, and we look up roses and only roses? Or if we're combining 2 different plants, we look up those 2 different plants and see if they make sense to combine into something, and then we have an analog based on that. There are so many plants and animals that it's pretty easy to find one that is similar to what we are thinking of. So a little bit of research into that can save us a tremendous amount of time down the road. My second tip is to use my rule of 3. What this means is to make 3 significant changes to the analog. So if we had a rose, don't make it look exactly the same. We want 3 changes that are important. Now with a plant, it's a little bit harder to think of significant changes, but with something like an elf as the basis, this is a little bit easier. Maybe we would remove the pointed ears, have them not live in forests, and not have them live to be 1,000 years or be immortal. Sometimes we describe something in such a way that people can tell what it is. For example, if I think of a large animal with thick skin, 4 huge feet, a giant belly, floppy ears, and a trunk, at some point in that description you're going to realize I'm describing an elephant. So we might want to change some of this, such as removing the trunk or maybe the big floppy ears. Now, some of those changes are not significant, they're superficial, but you get the idea. You basically want to change this so that people don't immediately recognize your analog. Tip number 3 is to use names wisely. If you call something an elf, people are going to expect the pointed ears and it living in a forest at the very least. So if it doesn't do either of these things, then people are going to expect that, and then you're going to surprise them in a way that might not be a good surprise. So if we followed my rule of 3 and made 3 significant changes, those changes may warrant a new name. Similarly, if we have something that's completely different and was not the basis for an analog, then don't use a familiar word. For example, a few years ago, I was watching a movie where they were calling something a goblin, and then something like a half an hour passed before the goblin came on screen. And when it finally appeared, it wasn't a goblin like I was expecting. I thought it would be something small, maybe green, and instead it was basically a gorilla. It literally looked and acted like a gorilla. I was almost surprised that it didn't pull out a banana and take a bite out of it. The only difference was that they had given it horns, and they had decided that it had a love of gold, and therefore the gorilla looked like it had taken its front paws and maybe back paws and stuffed them into liquid gold, and that had stuck when it pulled them out. So they keep calling it a goblin, and I get to the scene and I'm expecting a goblin and I see a gorilla. So this was jarring in a way that wasn't good, and this is an example of not using names wisely. They should have just called it something else entirely, not taken the name for something familiar and slapped it on a completely different thing. Tip number 4 is to mix and match your analogs. So let's say you are creating a new country. You might want to take a staple food like fish and rice from Japan, and then something else from Nazi Germany, and then maybe something like the clothing from an African tribe. If we mix things up like this, it's less likely that anyone's going to recognize where we got each of these sources. On the other hand, if we take everything from a single country like Japan, then it's going to become a little bit more obvious. When it comes to analogs, look at the Earth like a buffet. You've got all these choices, from styles of dress to ways of greeting each other to attitudes about one thing or another, like marital arrangements, sex, sleeping arrangements, the way people dine. Some places are going to be hearty, some people are going to be really refined. Just take things from everywhere. Don't take it all from one country. We can do the same thing with animals. Maybe we want to take the pack animal aspect of wolves and combine it with the highly trainable aspect of dogs. But maybe we're actually trying to create something like a bird, or a bird of prey like a falcon or a hawk, which don't typically have either of those behaviors. So now we have the appearance of one and 2 of the behaviors from something else. This helps us create a different kind of animal that looks similar maybe, or maybe we've even changed the appearance, but it has new attributes. And this is another thing we can do where sometimes we want to use an earth animal which doesn't act the way we would like it to, so we should invent our own. And one way to do that is to mix and match analogs. Tip number 5 is to make your analogs worth it. For example, let's say we take a horse and the only change we make is to add an extra pair of legs. This isn't really going to have any impact on this unless we've decided that it's faster, but if every horse in that world has 6 legs, then that horse is the same as all the other ones, so what's the difference? The other issue is that a change like that, if it's not impacting the horse, people are going to forget it unless we keep describing it as a 6-legged horse. The difference is if we are in a visual medium where we keep seeing it on screen and we see that it has 2 extra legs, then we don't need to comment on it, but most of us are probably authors. This tip also leads back to one of the earlier tips about using names wisely. If this 6-legged horse is still called a horse, unless you keep referring to it as a 6-legged horse, and if you just keep calling it a horse, in time people are going to forget those extra pairs of legs because they aren't relevant. So in this case, you might want to make even more changes to this so-called horse and then not call it a horse. There's a kind of mental inertia to a familiar term like horse, so this is one reason to use a different term and make up more names. And what I'm getting at here is that if we keep using the familiar term, people's memory of what is different about your so-called horse is just going to slowly fade away with repetition, and they're going to forget about it. Okay, that's it for these 5 tips on how to use analogs. While these tips come directly from 185 tips on world building, those tips are actually based on Creating Life, which is volume 1 of the Art of World Building book series. So there's a lot more in the book that goes into more detail about all of this. If you like the video, please like it and subscribe. I should be doing a lot more of these short videos on how to do one thing or another in just 5 or 10 quick tips. Thanks for watching. By the way, if you'd like more stuff to help with world building, my artofworldbuilding.com site has a bunch of free templates that you can download by joining the mailing list. You can click the link in the episode description or the little information button in the upper right-hand corner. There are over 20 of these templates, as you can see from this list. Most of them are Microsoft Word documents, but the 2 calculator ones, which come from my Creating Places book, are Excel spreadsheets that take care of the math for you. You can just type in measurements from a map and find out how long it takes to go somewhere by dragon, wagon, foot, or even ships. If you're enjoying the video, remember to click the like button and subscribe.